Progressivism can accurately be defined as a way of life that demands purity, submission, and obedience of our minds, bodies, and souls. I have a bit of a fixation on definitions of what things are, looking at the core things or trying to understand why does this work with that thing? How come these two things are going together? This doesn't seem to be right. You look at an organization, you look at a system that apparently is about the rights of a certain group and their emancipation and their empowerment and their freedom to do whatever they want to do. And then you look at another group that seems to be more about putting them into this security where they're an endangered group. They must be protected from the rest of the world. They should be limited. They should be controlled. They shouldn't be allowed to go out in public by themselves. They should be protected at all costs. Like they're not able to actually make certain decisions on their own. And there are a few things that kind of mesh together. But then you wonder, how do these two people groups or thoughts and things kind of come together? And then you might be guessing what I'm talking about here, but I was watching some of the recent protests and riots that were going on. There was coverage of the protests going on in the United States of America, and there was this woman. I feel like I made this video before. If this is a repeat, apologies. But the thought itself came after I was watching some coverage of the recent protests in the United States of America. This was somewhere in Seattle. It was in the Northwest. It might have been Portland. But there was one female. I think she identified as a female. I even remember saying this before. I might have talked about it in a separate video where I was talking about the connection with Islam and progressivism. And I kind of just gave a spoiler. Not a spoiler. This is what I'm talking about here. She was wearing a hijab emblazoned with, I think, Black Lives Matter on the front of it, and she was yelling out to a bullhorn, walking down the street and things like this. It was being recorded in a live stream from somebody. And I was wondering how, okay, so I've had these things. People have been wondering, how do these things work together? Feminism and Islam. Talked about how we should be all feminist Islamists and things like that in different places. So is there something like Feminislamist? Feminism? Can that be a thing? And I was thinking, okay, these are based on progressivism and Islam. There's certain aspects of Islam and progressivism that seem completely antithetical to each other. And I do agree with that, but that's not everything. It's like anything else. There is the actual thing. Problems occur not because of what X actually is, but how we define X. So when you see one of the popular images that came out from the Women's March in 2017 was this one image of a female wearing a hijab with an American flag on it. And you're wondering, how is this working together? How are you putting those things together? But when you look at it, when you look at the actual definition of what Islam is, and it is actually defined as a way of life that demands purity, submission, and obedience. And that's just what I took, because I thought it just clicked to me. Progressivism in and of itself is a way of life. The way it's actually used and applied by other people is something else. So what is it at the core? What is it at the basis? You can talk about the way people practice Islam, and that's not necessarily covered by the basics of what is the X. When you're talking about X, Islam, X, so, progressivism. What is the X? What is the basics of it? And do those basics go together? Now, the believers, and when I posted this, some people coming and talking about, oh, progressivism isn't about this, isn't about that, or Islam isn't about this. I'm like, look, we're talking about the other things. I'm not talking about the actual, I'm talking about the actual thing, the actual X. I don't want to hear about who in the Bible, what Christian does what. Some Christians will look at the part from the Bible, I think in Exodus 21, that says you can keep slaves. If you can beat your slave as long as the slave doesn't die, you can pass him on to your kids. And if your slave doesn't die, you won't be punished for it. So that is a rather, in the words, it doesn't say, there's nowhere else in the Bible that literally says slaves are wrong or goes back and says what we said in Exodus 21. Forget that. But they'll say, oh, that's the Old Testament, or they'll find ways to kind of think around it. But other people will accurately use that as a defense to keep slaves. Some people go and read things about adultery and be like, oh yeah, okay, so adultery is bad, but we're not going to stone people, take people to the gates and stone them because they have premarital sex anymore. There's different things. So the book is the actual book. It's actually just words. Somebody looks at Star Wars. This is another example I gave. people look at Star Wars and they say, okay, Disney has ruined Star Wars now. Star Wars is supposed to be this, it's supposed to be about Luke, it's supposed to be about this and this. Like, no, Star Wars is literally just a story that George Lucas made up. He's trying to sell some money. He wanted to tell a story in his mind. Maybe not even trying to sell some money. I got some stories in my head that I just want to get out there and communicate to people. It was a script. It was put out there. It was a story. And then people came out and they acted it. Actors and actresses, and they made the sets, amazing sets with like Lucas Arts and things like that. So they did all that. That's all it is. But now, to the actual people who become fans of it, true fans TM, they actually have something else. It means something else to them. The way they actually act out Star Wars is an entirely different thing. The way they live what Star Wars is not necessarily definitive of what Star Wars actually is as the X, as the basic, as the actual definition. But it is something else to them. So when it comes to progressivism, I just went and got this description directly from the Wikipedia page of what Islam as a way of life says. Because Islam itself is a religion, but it's more. It goes into other things. It's socio-political, the way you deal with people. But at the basis, it's defined as a way of life that demands purity, submission, and obedience. Now I added the of our minds, bodies, and souls, because that is something that happens with progressivism. Listen and believe. If we say this is the way it is, this is the way it's supposed to be. Of the bodies, it says, okay, my body, health at any size. You have to if I say my body is something else, it's something else. It doesn't matter what you say. I can define everything. And the souls, goes into your thoughts. You're supposed to think and feel this way. It's not okay for me to be allowed to do this, but something about you has to actually follow this actual thing that I am thinking. I have to actually have control. You can have this inherent evil. You can be inherently born in these things. And that is a thing. And I think that's how come something like Islam can actually mesh with it. There's also many Christians that are progressives. It's this, I just wanted to this is a thought that came to me that kind of made me think of why there could be some crossover between these groups. Now, depending, that female I saw with that blowhorn, she might actually look at Islam and accept just the basic acts of it and say it's a way of life that demands purity, submission, and obedience. A certain level of purity. And she has looked at what is offered by certain practices of the current secular religion that is progressivism and seen that I can actually use some of these things in order to achieve my defined agreement and acceptance of having a way of life that demands purity, submission, and obedience of her mind, her body, her soul, and those around her. That's just a thought. I think with those around her, that comes in my whole premise or thought or hypothesis that we've come to like a metheist thing, which is post polytheism, post monotheism, into a metheist thing that I think is hopefully one step away from the reality that there are no gods in that situation, at least with no evidence for it, and we actually do somehow define our reality tunnel. But it comes to a point where we still have that teaching that's been ingrained in human psyche, in human cultural psyche, that's still developing in us, where we have these questions and we feel like, okay, let's put it on someone else. But now we're starting to see, oh, we actually have control. We have unprecedented control that at least that we know of, and we'll have a lot more control over our day-to-day lives, over our physical bodies, over our futures, our memories. We're going to have so much more control of that. And I think as that knowledge is coming, that awareness, we start transferring that idea of the supernatural, of the gods, of that onto us, or that power where we feel we can actually go out and change and be the source of the power that changes everybody else's life, rather than just our perception of what everybody else is doing in our life. That makes any sense. Check out that other Metheism video. Anyway, that's it for now. This is part of my shorty series where I expand on some shorts. I was curious if I was actually going to be able to actually expand on this. And I feel I have talked about this in a previous video. If you've actually heard a previous video where I mentioned this, let me know what that was in. If I remember, I'll let it know. But I do think there are things specifically I talked about in this version of it where it was specifically things that I hadn't mentioned before in that other one. So I'm happy enough with posting this without feeling like I'm gypping you, who I appreciate you taking your time to come listen. Let me know what you think about this. Let me know if you disagree with my definition, and let me know if you kind of knew or if you heard of that description of Islam, because a few people got it when I actually posted it before. I wonder how many people actually had heard that description of Islam before as a way of life. Till next time, like, share, subscribe. Links below to merchandise store. If you're on YouTube, hit the notification bell. And more coming soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President-elect of the United States, Donald John Trump.